Hi, everybody. This is the first of three short videos on the history of Canadian trade policy. The purpose of going through this history is not that you memorize every specific event and date and personality, but to give a sense of how important trade has been over Canada's history, as well as understanding some of the policy debates that keep reoccurring, as well as the fundamental shifts that have occurred. So the first video, this one, is pre-Confederation up until 1987. And the third video is 1988 up until the present. The second video is a case study of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. That agreement was so important, that debate was so significant that it represents a fundamental shift in Canadian trade policy. And that's why instead of just doing a short analysis, it gets its own video. So I am just going to pull up the slides for the first video. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is Canadian trade policy pre-Confederation to 1987. So Canada has always been a trading nation. And most of those exports have been resource-based, whether that is the fur trade, which helped to explore Canada, whether that is fish, wheat, lumber, then we get into oil and gas and other minerals. And that has really been sort of the tradition of Canadian trade policy. Over time, we've added manufactured products, particularly in the auto sector, as well as services, particularly tourism and financial services. But the initial period really was primary products. We also have this battle in the early years of Canada about trade with Britain versus trade with the United States. On the one hand, we had these colonial ties with Britain that then became imperial and Commonwealth ties, as well as sentimental ties to Britain, versus the geographic ties to the United States. And therefore, this initial time period is really trying to establish Canada's access in either the British market or the American market. What makes this complicated in both countries' cases is it wasn't necessarily all about commercial agreements and economics. There was a whole series of non-commercial sentiments, cultural sentiments, historical ties, legal ties in the case of Britain, concerns about dependency in the case of the United States. Therefore, managing Canadian trade policy and why it's important in Canada is it's not just about economics, it's about identity as well. So this is just a snapshot of Canadian trade in the initial period after World War II up until the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. And what it shows is the greater and greater importance linked to gross national product and exports, as well as Canada's share of world trade. So these are the key agreements we're going to look at. The Reciprocity Treaty that predates Canadian Confederation, the role of trade in Confederation, John A. Macdonald's national policy, the Laurier government, particularly its Reciprocity Treaty with the United States of 1911, and the defeat of that treaty and the defeat of the Laurier government in the election, the imperial preferences that Mackenzie King negotiated with the United Kingdom and the other dominions, GATT, the Auto Pact, the third option, and then we'll conclude as we enter the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So these are exports up until the end of World War II. And what you can see here is the dominance of the United Kingdom as a source of exports up until roughly the end of World War I. Even though the United Kingdom was on the victorious side of World War I, its economy really cratered. And after that, we start to see more and more trade with the United States, as well as other countries. When it comes to imports, however, the imports largely came from the United States, almost from the beginning of Canada. And you can see just how important imports from the US were during this time period. All right, so the first event is the 1854 Reciprocity Treaty. This was a treaty with the United States. It would allow the Canadian colonies access to the US market, but keep us politically within the British Empire. Getting the Americans on side weren't easy. There were Americans who said, well, instead of negotiating a trade agreement with Canada, with the Canadian colonies, they should just annex British North America. Other Americans didn't want a trade agreement that was focused on primary products, natural resources, as opposed to manufacturing products. There was also a powerful protectionist lobby within the US government adopting the ideas of Alexander Hamilton. And we've talked about Hamilton's ideas as it related to infant industry in previous lectures. Governor General Lord Elgin worked with a number of American administrations, and we did reach a reciprocity treaty in 1854 that included the Canadian colonies, which was Canada East and Canada West, modern day Ontario and Quebec, as well as the maritime colonies. There was tariff-free access to the US market for Canada's traditional exports. This would be things like fish and lumber. The US, in return, would have access to the Atlantic fishery and free navigation on the Great Lakes. Why that was significant is after the War of 1812, there was a limit on navigation on the Great Lakes, and that was now reopened 40 years later. In the United States, both the New England states and the Midwestern states continued to oppose it. There was also concerns about the role of Britain and its support of the Confederacy during the American Civil War, and these factors contributed to the abrogation of the treaty in 1866. What were the effects of this reciprocity treaty? Well, one, trade between the US and Canada increased, and that is consistent with our understanding of trade theory. And it also achieved a mythical status as a time of great prosperity for Canada. And so here's a long quote from a Liberal fishing minister from PEI several decades later. And he said, since the maritime provinces were peopled, there was never a decade when prosperity was so marked among all classes, when land rose in value so quickly, when the wharves were so lined with shipping, when the workmen had such steady employment, when the farmers had as good a market as between 1854 and 1866, when we had reciprocal trade with the United States. That's a good illustration of what I say was the myth of that agreement. It also provided the colonies with a commercial policy when Britain started to end the colonial system. It confirmed that the United States was a viable alternative market to Britain. It set the stage for further cooperation with the United States, ending fears of annexation. And it was a leading cause of confederation. That once the Canadian colonies lost their free trade agreement with the United States, they had to start to think about working together east to west as opposed to north-south. Okay. That leads us to Macdonald's national policy. This was a series of policies in the mid-1870s developed by our first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. And it was the first time a Canadian politician linked tariff policy with Canada's national development. And there were three aspects of the national policy. There was the railroad across the prairies to Vancouver, linking the province of British Columbia with the rest of Canada. Immigration to populate the prairies to ensure that they remain part of British North America. And the one that we're going to focus on is developing a very high tariff wall to promote import substitution industries, which would allow investment inside of Canada and the developing of a manufacturing base inside of Canada to avoid this tariff wall. And it would also reduce immigration to the United States in search of industrial jobs. This was a problem in Canada, as we were losing people because they felt that there was greater economic opportunities in the United States than there was in Canada, and it was leading to depopulation. So here's an editorial cartoon at the time, and what it shows is the Americans staring over that tariff wall. There's Johnny MacDonald in his top hat, showing how Canadian farmers and Canadian mechanics were now in luxury because of this tariff wall. It was also a response to U.S. Manifest Destiny, the belief that the U.S. was going to create a continental country. It was going to expand west. It was going to expand south. And there were some advocates who wanted to expand north. And what Macdonald tried to do was maintain Canada's independence. It also provided a basis for consolidating Canada and, once again, preventing its absorption into the United States. It reflected concerns about U.S. attitudes, but if the United States could develop a continental country, so could Canada. And by linking British Columbia with central Canada and Atlantic Canada, with populating the prairies, with creating domestic economic development, it would ensure that Canadians would stay home instead of moving. But this also relied upon U.S. investment within Canada. A couple decades later, we have the Reciprocity Agreement. There's U.S. President William Taft on the right. He gives his message to Congress in December of 2010, and he proposes a comprehensive reciprocity agreement with Canada. In the end, Canada and the United States do reach an agreement on reducing and in some cases removing tariffs on a whole variety of raw goods, but also processed products, manufactured products. It was the first major agreement on trade between the two countries since that reciprocity agreement 60 years prior. And it looked like Laurier had delivered a really good deal. It allowed Canada to export our advantages in national products without compromising the protections that the manufacturing sector had due to John A. Macdonald. The U.S. Congress easily ratifies the 1911 agreement, but in Canada, it led to huge debate in the House of Commons. The Liberals, with Laurier, supported the agreement. The Conservative Party of Robert Borden opposed it. And the election of 1911 was fought over free trade, with Robert Borden forming a majority government. This would not be the last election on free trade. This is why we're going to be looking at the 1988 election as well. The traditional view of the 1911 election is that Laurier's defeat was because of reciprocity. And what you saw was an assertion of Canadian nationalism and particularly loyalty to Britain against fears of American domination. Others have argued, though, that reciprocity was just one issue that the election was fought on. After all, the Liberals had been in government for 15 years, and there was growing dissatisfaction with them. There was controversy over the creation of a Canadian Navy, particularly in Quebec, where Francophone Quebec believed that the Canadian Navy was being developed simply to support British imperialism. And the Conservatives ran a really good campaign. A closer examination, though, of the election shows how important one special interest group was, and that was the pork packers, particularly in the province of Quebec. And that had they carved out an exemption for pork packers, the Laurier and the Liberal Party would likely have brought in a majority government, and we would have seen the reciprocity agreement be implemented. Canada's pork industry had been increasing dramatically over the previous couple decades due to a drop in feed prices, better slaughtering techniques, as well as tariff protection. And they were worried that reciprocity would wipe out the pork packing industry in Canada. And so one of the major companies, the William Davis Company, launched a spirited lobbying campaign against the agreement. These included newspaper ads, lobbying of the Laurier government, campaigning for the Conservatives during the election, and their campaign slogan was "No trucker trade with the Yankees." During the election campaign, Laurier argued that this would benefit consumers. It would also raise the prices for pig farmers, and he targeted the Canadian Pork Trust. And by attacking Toronto, which was known at the time and would still be known for decades later as Hogtown. I may be showing my age there, but I remember Toronto being called Hogtown. Toronto was seen as a conservative stronghold. And so by targeting the pork industry of Toronto, Laurier hoped to appeal to pig farmers in rural Quebec. In the end, the biggest losses for the Liberals were 21 Quebec seats, all along the north shore of the St. Lawrence River, eastern Quebec. That's where the hog farms were. And so there has been some work done primarily by my colleague Eugene Bulow over at the University of Calgary, who has shown that it was really the pork packers and that aspect of the debate that fundamentally changed the 1911 election. And this is just some of his analysis, and tried to show if there was reciprocity that excluded the pork industry, it was likely that the Liberals would have been reelected. This highlights the power that a special interest group has, and it is something that we've talked about in looking at trade theory and how trade creates winners and losers. Okay. Fast forward a couple more decades, we have the Imperial Economic Conference. This was in the midst of the Great Depression. As we showed, the Smoot-Hawley tariffs that came out in 1930 led to bigger than neighbor trade policies around the world and a collapse of global trade. And so this was a way for the British Commonwealth, the United Kingdom, as well as the independent dominions, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, would get together and have their own trade agreement. And it did establish such a policy, a series of bilateral agreements giving most favored nation status. These trade agreements were not negotiated by all 5 countries, but a series of bilateral agreements. So Canada with Australia, Canada with New Zealand with Australia. This would later become the model for GATT, as well as the WTO and other international trade agreements. It also showed that having the prime minister lead the negotiations was a problem. Trade had become much more complex, and that you need professional trade officials to negotiate it. The high-level stuff, yeah, that should be done by the prime minister and a trade minister, but the nitty-gritty stuff needed people to specialize in trade. And so this discovery after the fact led to the development of trade officials, and that would become beneficial when the negotiations over GATT would occur after World War II. So After, in the later stages of World War II, there was a lot of planning for what the post-World War peace would look like. There was one set of planning around the United Nations and dealing with political security concerns. But there was another that was focused on what an economic situation were, because they saw a clear linkage between the Great Depression and the war. This led to a series of agreements at Bretton Woods on monetary policy with the International Monetary Fund, on development and reconstruction, what would eventually be known as the World Bank, and there was efforts at a trade organization. And that trade organization would become the GATT. From a Canadian perspective, this was beneficial because for much of our history, it was a debate about whether Canada should trade with Britain or whether Canada should trade with the United States. And then finally, someone said, why not both? Why can't we trade with both? Let's create an organization that gives us access to both the American market and the British market, and that would become GATT. And throughout the GATT years, from the late 1940s up until 1995, there was a consensus in Canada amongst the political parties, amongst the business class, amongst the public, to use the multilateral GATT system to advance Canadian trade interests. But GATT had its drawbacks. Canada was one of many countries, and really the United States and the Europeans set much of the agenda. In multilateral negotiations, it's the common denominator that takes place, and so there's a lot of sacrifices that have to be made. And it was a very slow and cumbersome process. So we started to look at sectoral trade, and the biggest success around the sectoral trade was the Auto Pact that was negotiated in 1965. And there were two agreements, one between the government of Canada and the government of the United States, but there was a separate agreement with the big three automakers, Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors. It was in automobiles and auto parts, and it was a great success. Canadians got better choice, they got lower prices, and there was a substantial increase in Canadian employment. The Auto Pact was so important that 20 years later, in the midst of the free trade election, both the yes side and the no side said and referenced the success of the Auto Pact. The third option. So this is the official portrait of Richard Nixon and the Nixon shocks of 1971. And what this was pulling out of the fixed exchange rate in the IMF, as well as a 10% across the board surcharge on imports. This would have had a devastating effect on the Canadian economy, given how much trade Canada had with the United States. Eventually, after some strong lobbying by the Canadian government, the surcharge decision was reversed, but it showed how vulnerable Canada was to US unilateral trade actions. And so External Affairs Minister Mitchell Sharp drafted his three options essay in response to this. Option one is Canada could maintain the status quo. Status quo is always an option in policy. Continue the way we're going, but that would make us vulnerable to US unilateral action. Option two, Canada could move to greater integration with the United States, such as pursuing a comprehensive free trade agreement, not just a sectoral agreement like we saw in the Auto Pact. The third option, which was a long-term strategy to diversify our way from trade with the United States to other countries. This would reduce Canadian vulnerability to unilateral American shocks. And what we tried to do was focus on trade with Europe and Japan. And there was a series of meetings and negotiations with both the Europeans and the Japanese. It did raise the knowledge level, the attention of Canada, but not a single tariff was reduced, not a single non-tariff trade barrier was dropped as a result of that. The search for finding diversification, we're also going to look at when it comes to investment policy, because there was a series of domestic policy initiatives, the creation of FIRA, the Foreign Investment Review Agency, the National Energy Program, as well as Canadian content legislation for cultural industries that affected television, radio, magazines, and booksellers. What the third option did show is how difficult it is for governments to fundamentally alter the flow of trade and investment. Because as we mentioned in some of the introductory lectures, trade is determined by producers and consumers. And there was a whole set of reasons why Canadian producers and Canadian consumers preferred trade with the United States, with Japan, and with the United States. It could have been geographic links, it could have been language, it could have been culture, but regardless, it meant that businesses wanted North-South trade. They were less interested with trade in Europe and Japan. What governments can do is negotiate lower trade barriers, reduce discrimination based on nationality, but it's up to businesses to take advantage of that, and it's up to consumers to start to want products from other countries. What Sharpe's essay did show is the impact on the dependence of the United States, and that continues to be a major discussion point in Canadian foreign policy. But what Sharpe did do was ignore economic reality. He overestimated the willingness of the Japanese and the European governments to make concessions, real concessions that would make a difference. So Tom Axworthy, who was principal secretary to Pierre Trudeau at the time, in his memoirs said, the ability of government to redraw trading patterns was too limited to turn the diversification goal of the third option into a reality. In defending its policy of autonomy, the Trudeau government opted for Canadian independence. It successfully withstood the protests of the US government, but it was less successful in persuading the Canadian business community of the wisdom of this course. Ironically, a subsequent Canadian government, the Mulroney government, looked at these same three options and chose option 2, negotiating a comprehensive free trade agreement. And that is why we're carving that story out for a separate video. We'll wrap this up with a couple more statistics. This shows the dependency that we had post-World War II on the United States as a target of our exports, as well as the amount of imports that came from the United States. This clearly shows how dependent Canada has been on the United States. So this concludes video 1 on the history of Canadian trade policy. These slides have also been put up separately on Blackboard, and we will come back to this when we look at video 2, which is a case study of the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. So stay tuned for that. Thank you and goodbye.